Picture this. You lose someone. A grandparent, maybe, or a close friend. And at some point in the days that follow, you find yourself doing something strange when you really stop to think about it. You put their body in a box. You dig a hole. You lower them into the earth, and you cover them up, and you mark the spot with a stone so you can come back to it. Nobody taught you the biological reason for any of this. It isn't hygiene, not really, not anymore. It's something older than that. Something that lives underneath the ritual. Now imagine you're not in a funeral home. Imagine you're standing in a limestone cave in the Zagros Mountains, 60,000 years ago, and the person you're burying isn't quite like you. Heavier brow, broader chest, a face built for a colder, harder world. You have no metal tools. No written language. No religion in any form you'd recognize. And yet you are doing almost exactly the same thing modern humans do today. You are digging. You are placing the body with care. And in some cases, according to researchers, you might even be laying flowers on top. So here's the big question this video is going to answer. Why did ancient humans bury their dead? Why, out of every possible way to deal with a corpse, walking away from it, leaving it for scavengers, tossing it in a river, did our ancestors, and even some species that weren't quite our ancestors, choose to dig and cover and mark the ground? Why does this behavior show up again and again, across continents, across tens of thousands of years, long before anyone invented the wheel? Seriously, think about that. A creature with no written history, no internet, no shared global culture, independently arrives at the same solemn act, over and over, everywhere humans go. And here's the thing. The answer isn't one clean explanation. It's not just religion. It's not just hygiene. It's not just love. It's layered, like sediment itself, one explanation stacked on top of another, each one only telling part of the story. Biology is down at the bottom. Psychology sits above that. Social bonding stacks on top of that. And right at the surface, culture and belief. By the end of this video, you're going to see all of those layers at once, and I promise you, the full picture is stranger, older, and more moving than you expect. Let's start with the deepest layer, because it's the one most people get wrong immediately. Most people assume burial started with us. Homo sapiens. Modern humans doing modern human things. But that's not what the evidence says. Let's talk about Shanidar Cave. Shanidar sits in the Kurdistan region of northern Iraq, and starting in the late 1950s, an archaeologist named Ralph Selecki began excavating a series of Neanderthal skeletons there, individuals now known as Shanidar 1 through Shanidar 10. One of them, Shanidar 4, became one of the most famous fossils in the history of paleoanthropology because Selecki's team found unusually high concentrations of pollen clustered around the body. He proposed something audacious for the time. That Neanderthals had placed flowers on their dead. The press ran with it. People called it the flower burial, and for decades it became the go-to symbol of Neanderthal humanity. Now, here's where the science gets interesting rather than simple, because that's usually how real science goes. Later researchers pushed back hard on the flower theory, pointing out that a species of burrowing rodent called the Persian jerd is known to stockpile flowering plants underground in that exact region, and that could account for the pollen just as easily as human hands could. For years, that cast a shadow over the whole idea. But then, in 2018, a team from Cambridge University led by Dr. Emma Pomeroy went back to Shanidar and excavated a brand new, remarkably intact skeleton, now called Shanidar Z, an individual who died around 70,000 years ago. What they found was a body that had been deliberately placed in a shallow, carved depression in the ground, curled on its side, with a large stone positioned near the head, seemingly as a marker. The excavation showed the ground had been intentionally hollowed out before the body was placed there. That's not scavenger behavior. That's not accidental preservation. That is a decision. Picture a species with none of the technology we associate with civilization, choosing, on purpose, to shape the earth into a resting place for one of their own. That's not a metaphor. That's the oldest funeral we can currently point to with real confidence. Now let's jump forward in time, but also sideways in species, to our own direct ancestors, at Qafzeh Cave in what is now Israel. Around 100,000 years ago, early Homo sapiens buried a series of individuals there, including a child laid to rest with the antlers of a red deer positioned across the chest, deliberately arranged rather than randomly scattered. Excavations led by researchers including Bernard van der Merch through the 20th century documented multiple burials at the site, with grave goods that show intention, not accident. An antler doesn't fall onto a chest and land in a symmetrical position by coincidence. Someone placed it there. Here's the concrete image to hold onto. A parent, 100,000 years before agriculture, before pottery, before anything we'd call a city, kneeling over a small body, and reaching for an animal's antler, and setting it down like an offering. That single gesture tells you something almost unbearable. Grief this specific, this deliberate, is not a modern invention. It's baked into the species. Now let's talk about something even more staggering, because if Qafzeh shows you intention, Sungir shows you obsession. Sungir is a site in Russia, near the city of Vladimir, dated to around 34,000 years ago. In the 1950s and 60s, Soviet archaeologists led by Otto Bada uncovered a set of burials there that still stop researchers in their tracks. Two adolescents, buried head-to-head, covered in roughly 10,000 mammoth ivory beads combined. 10,000. Each of those beads, based on experimental replication studies, took somewhere around 30 to 45 minutes to individually carve and drill by hand using stone tools. Do the math on that for a second. That's potentially thousands of hours of skilled labor poured into decorating two dead children. Alongside the beads, the burials included ivory spears, carved animal figurines, and fox tooth ornaments, an almost unimaginable investment of a community's time and resources, at a moment in human history when every single hour spent not hunting or gathering was an hour that could cost the group its survival. Picture a hunter-gatherer band on the edge of an ice age, food never guaranteed, temperatures brutal, choosing to spend weeks of collective labor decorating the dead instead of directly feeding the living. There's another detail from Sungir that tends to get skipped over, and it's arguably the most revealing part. Skeletal analysis of the two adolescents suggests at least one of them had a bowed, likely pathological femur, meaning this individual may have had a physical disability affecting mobility. And yet they were buried with the same lavish care, the same thousands of beads, as anyone else in that community. In a world defined by mammoth hunts and ice age survival, where physical ability could mean the difference between eating and starving, this individual wasn't buried as an afterthought. If anything, the burial is one of the richest ever found from the entire Upper Paleolithic period. That tells you something about how this community valued a person, not for what their body could do, but for who they were within the group. That's the takeaway line worth sitting with. When a starving world still finds time to bury its dead in beauty, and still honors a person who couldn't hunt as much as anyone else in camp, that tells you burial was never just a luxury, and it was never just about labor or usefulness. It was a need, rooted in something closer to belonging. Now here's something else that almost never comes up in these conversations, and it's the layer underneath even Sungir and Qafzeh. Before there was elaborate ritual, there was color, and specifically, there was red ochre. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, researchers led by Christopher Henshelwood have recovered engraved ochre pieces and ochre processing kits dating back roughly 100,000 years, some of the earliest confirmed evidence of symbolic material culture in our species. Ochre shows up smeared on bodies in graves across multiple continents and tens of thousands of years, from Sungir to sites across Western Europe. Some researchers believe the red pigment was meant to symbolically replace blood, restoring a kind of life color to a body that had lost it. Think about the psychology embedded in that single choice. A color chosen specifically because it looks like living blood, painted onto a corpse specifically because it doesn't have any. That's a species already grappling, in a very concrete, physical way, with the difference between alive and not alive, and trying to do something about the gap. Now let's shift from archaeology to biology, because burial doesn't exist in a vacuum, it exists because grief itself is not uniquely human, and that changes the whole conversation. Primatologists have documented chimpanzees engaging in behaviors that look astonishingly like mourning. In a well-known observation published by researchers studying a chimpanzee community in Bossou, Guinea, in the mid-2000s, Mothers were seen carrying the mummified bodies of their dead infants for days, sometimes weeks, grooming them, carrying them through daily routines, long after death. Jane Goodall documented similar attachment behaviors decades earlier at Gom. Elephants, too, have been repeatedly observed standing over the bones of dead herd members, touching the skulls and tusks with their trunks in a way researchers describe as investigatory and prolonged, behavior that shows up specifically around elephant remains and almost nowhere else. None of these species dig graves. That's important, keep that in mind, we'll come back to it. But what they do show is that the emotional wiring underneath burial, the part of the brain that refuses to simply abandon the dead, predates burial itself by millions of years. Grief came first. The shovel came later. So here's a punchy way to put it. Humans didn't invent grief when we invented the grave. We just finally had the hands, and the tools, and the social structure to do something physical with a feeling every social mammal already carries. Now let's talk about a more practical, less romantic layer, because if we only talked about emotion, we'd be telling half the story. There's a hard, biological argument for burial too, and it comes down to disease. A decomposing body is a genuine health hazard. It attracts scavengers, which draws predators closer to camp. It can contaminate water sources. It produces smells that, evolutionarily speaking, our brains are wired to find repulsive for very good reason, because disgust is one of the oldest disease avoidance systems we have, studied extensively by researchers like Valerie Curtis at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, whose work in the 2000s and 2010s helped establish disgust as an evolved behavioral immune response. Burying a body removes the threat. It puts a physical barrier between the living and a potential source of pathogens or predators. Picture a small band of 40 or 50 people, completely dependent on a single water source and a single sleeping area. A body left in the open isn't just sad, it's dangerous, practically speaking, in a very immediate, very physical sense. Burial solves an emotional problem and a survival problem at the exact same time, and that overlap is probably no coincidence. Evolution tends to favor behaviors that do double duty. Now let's build on that, because there's a social layer stacked right on top of the biological one. Burial marks territory. A grave is a physical, lasting claim. Anthropologists studying the emergence of cemeteries and formal burial grounds have long connected the rise of dedicated burial sites with the rise of territorial behavior, especially as populations grew denser and resources became something worth defending. A buried ancestor is a kind of deed to the land. It says, our people have been here, our people are still here, in the ground, and that means this place belongs to us. This idea gets discussed extensively in the archaeological literature on the transition to more sedentary lifestyles, where formal cemeteries appear more consistently as groups start settling in one place for longer stretches, particularly moving into the Natufian culture in the Levant, around 12 to 15,000 years ago, right before the invention of agriculture. Here's the image. A cemetery isn't just a place of mourning. It's a flag planted in the dirt that says, we were here first, and generations of our dead can prove it. All right. Now let's get to the part of the story that dismantles almost everything the average person assumes about all of this. Here's the biggest myth about ancient burial, and honestly, about Neanderthals specifically. Most people still picture Neanderthals as brutish, dumb, incapable of anything resembling emotional depth, a punchline more than a people. That image is decades out of date, and it's actively wrong based on the current fossil record. Go back to La Chapelle Auxiliary Saints in France, where in 1908 French paleontologists discovered a Neanderthal skeleton, an older male, likely somewhere around 40 years old, which for a Neanderthal in that era was genuinely elderly. What made this skeleton remarkable wasn't just that he'd been deliberately buried in a shallow pit, it's the state of his body. He had severe arthritis. He had lost most of his teeth. Several of his vertebrae showed signs of degenerative disease. And critically, his jaw showed evidence that he'd lost teeth long before death and the bone had healed and remodeled around the gaps. That means someone was feeding him. Someone was keeping him alive for what was likely years, in a world with no hospitals, no soft food processing, nothing but other Neanderthals choosing, actively, to care for a member of their group who could no longer hunt or fully chew his own food. Hold on, here's where everything you think you know gets dismantled. This wasn't an isolated case. Researchers have identified similar patterns of survived injury and long-term care across multiple Neanderthal sites, individuals with healed but severe fractures, blindness in one eye, amputated limbs, all showing signs of having lived for extended periods after the injury. A species incapable of compassion doesn't carry its disabled members for years. It doesn't carve out food for someone with no teeth. And it certainly doesn't dig a hole and lay that same person to rest with intention when they finally die. Burial, in this light, isn't the beginning of the compassion story. It's the final chapter of one that had already been going on for that person's entire adult life. That's a one-line gut punch worth remembering. The grave wasn't where Neanderthal compassion started. It's just where the evidence of it happened to survive. Now, before this turns into a tidy, uplifting story where every ancient human everywhere buried their dead with love and flowers, let's slow down, because the honest, responsible version of this story has real edges and real exceptions, and leaving those out would be misleading. Not every ancient human culture buried their dead in the ground, and not every culture that could have, did. At Lake Mungo in Australia, archaeologists have documented some of the oldest known cremation evidence on Earth, dating back roughly 40,000 years, where a body, now known as Mungo Lady, was cremated, and the bones were then crushed and reburied. That's a completely different ritual technology aimed at a similar emotional goal, and it shows up on a completely different continent from Shanidar or Sungir, developed independently. Meanwhile, some historical and still practiced traditions, like Tibetan sky burial or excarnation practices documented among certain Zoroastrian communities using structures called towers of silence, deliberately expose the dead to the elements and to scavenging birds rather than burying them, based on specific religious beliefs about purity and the separation of body from spirit. These aren't primitive alternatives to burial. They're equally sophisticated, equally intentional systems, just built on different beliefs about what a body means after death. There's also real, ongoing scientific debate about how much intention we can actually assign to the earliest examples. Some archaeologists have pushed back on interpretations of certain Neanderthal sites, arguing natural sediment deposition, cave collapse, or scavenger activity could explain some of the burial-like positioning researchers have identified, particularly at older or more disturbed sites where the evidence is less clean than at somewhere like Sungir. This is exactly why the 2018 Shanidar Z excavation mattered so much. It gave researchers cleaner, more controlled evidence than some of the older, more contested Neanderthal sites from decades earlier, when excavation techniques were far less precise than modern archaeology demands. And one more honest caveat. Even within Homo sapiens, formal cemetery burial as a widespread, default practice doesn't really stabilize until much later, closer to the Natufian period and the dawn of agriculture, when people started staying in one place long enough to need a permanent place for their dead. For most of human history before that, across roughly 200,000 years of Homo sapiens existing as a species, burial appears to have been the exception in the archaeological record, not the rule, likely because highly mobile groups didn't always have the time, safety, or resources to dig a grave before moving on. The dramatic examples we've covered, Sungir, Qafzeh, Shanidar, are remarkable precisely because they stand out against a much larger, quieter backdrop of humans who, for whatever reason, in whatever circumstance, didn't bury their dead at all. So the honest picture isn't ancient humans always buried their dead out of love. It's messier and more interesting than that. Burial was one option among several, chosen when circumstances, beliefs, and resources allowed for it, and abandoned or replaced with cremation, exposure, or something else entirely when they didn't. Now let's zoom out, because this is where the story stops being about the past and starts being about something much bigger. Terror management theory, a framework developed by psychologists Sheldon Solomon, Jeff Greenberg, and Tom Piszczynski starting in the late 1980s, building directly on the work of anthropologist Ernest Becker, argues that a huge amount of human culture, religion, art, nationalism, even the drive to have children or build lasting monuments, functions as a buffer against the unbearable knowledge that we are going to die. Their experimental research, run in labs across the world for decades now, has repeatedly shown that when people are subtly reminded of their own mortality, they respond by clinging harder to their cultural worldview, their group identity, their sense of meaning and legacy. Burial, under this lens, isn't just about the dead person. It's about the living, managing the unbearable fact that the same thing is coming for them. Think about what that means at civilizational scale. The pyramids of Giza. The terracotta army buried alongside Qin Shi Huang. Viking ship burials. Victorian mourning jewelry woven from human hair. War memorials with thousands of names carved into stone. All of it, arguably, traces its emotional roots back to that same Shanidar impulse, the refusal to just walk away and leave the body in the dirt unmarked. 100,000 years of technological explosion, from stone tools to space travel, and the core emotional software driving one of our most universal behaviors hasn't fundamentally changed. There's a strange, almost funny modern echo of this too. Think about how much money and effort still goes into death today, even in a world of hospitals and refrigeration where none of the old survival logic technically applies anymore. The funeral industry in the United States alone is valued at well over $20 billion a year, according to industry data tracked by the National Funeral Directors Association, spent on caskets, headstones, embalming, plots of land that will never be built on or farmed, just held, permanently, for one body each. From a purely practical standpoint, none of that is necessary anymore. We have crematoriums, we have space, we have no shortage of land the way a small Ice Age band did. And yet the instinct to mark, to memorialize, to spend resources we don't strictly need to spend, hasn't gone anywhere. If a Sungir hunter-gatherer walked through a modern cemetery, confused by the cars and the streetlights, the one thing that would probably still make immediate sense to them is the headstones. And it ripples into your own body too, right now, whether you've ever thought about it or not. The disgust you feel around decay, the specific ache of grief when you lose someone, the instinct to visit a grave, to leave flowers, to mark an anniversary of a death, none of that is culturally invented from scratch. It's a modern expression of circuitry that predates agriculture, predates cities, predates even our species in its current form. When you stand at a graveside, some very old part of your brain is doing something a Neanderthal in the Zagros Mountains was doing 70,000 years ago. So why did ancient humans bury their dead? Because grief is older than humanity itself, and burial was simply the moment that grief finally had hands. Because it solved a practical, biological problem, keeping disease and predators away from the living. Because it staked a claim to territory, saying, "We belong here, our dead prove it." Because a species capable of caring for its sick and injured for years was never going to abandon them the moment their heart stopped. And because somewhere, underneath all of it, is a fear every single one of us still carries, the fear of being forgotten, of simply ending, of vanishing without a trace. You will very likely, someday, stand at the edge of a grave, for someone you love, or, eventually, have someone stand at the edge of yours. When that happens, you won't be performing some invented modern custom. You'll be doing something that stretches back before written language, before cities, before even our own species stood alone on this planet. You'll be doing what a mother did at Qafzeh with a set of antlers. What a community did at Sungir with 10,000 beads of ivory. What another group did, 70,000 years ago, for someone we now just call Shanidar Zaid. We don't bury the dead because we forget them. We bury them because some part of us refuses to.